Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. For those of you who do not know, I'm joined with, to my right, Dr. Howard Zucker, the Commissioner of the New York State Department of Health. To my left, Linda Lacewell, Superintendent of the Department of Financial Services. I have been in government in multiple capacities. I was the Department of Housing and Urban Development Secretary and Deputy Secretary, Assistant Secretary for 8 years. I was Attorney General. I've been governor. I've seen a number of schemes, a number of frauds. I thought I had seen it all. The worst frauds are those frauds that go beyond individual harm to institutionalized systemic fraud. Student loan industry fraud, where banks were working in cahoots with schools all across the country. The housing fraud, the 2007, where banks were pushing bad housing paper. Tobacco fraud, settled in 1998, where the tobacco companies systematically knew they were selling a product that caused cancer and didn't say anything. The opioid scandal, the opioid scheme, is as diabolical, as brazen, as obnoxious, and as offensive as anything I have seen. They knew what they were doing. This was not accidental. It was purposeful. And it was an industry-wide conspiracy. The more evidence comes out, the clearer that is. It was the manufacturers of the product who knew exactly how addictive it was. It was the distributors, it was the retailers, in some cases, literally primary care physicians also involved. The damage has been immeasurable. Nationwide, they estimate 400,000 lives lost over the past decade. 400,000. New York State, last year, 3,000 deaths from opioids. That's 3 times what it was in 2010. 9,000 emergency room visits. And that is despite all the efforts that we've taken on the state side. And we have the Dr. Zucker here. I believe we have the most aggressive program to combat opioids in the country. Primary drugs, Oxycontin, hydrocodone, oxycodone. Major manufacturers, Purdue, Johnson & Johnson now, the Sackler family that has made billions of dollars from this product. And what's even more disturbing is the companies knew. The companies knew. 2007, Purdue officials plead guilty to a criminal charge that they misled regulators about suspicious activity from distributors. That was 2007. That was 12 years ago. Purdue officials pled guilty. So they knew. Now, the drug companies will say, well, heroin and fentanyl cause more deaths. They're right. Heroin and fentanyl cause more deaths. What they don't tell you is that 80% of the people who are on heroin say they became addicted from prescription pain medication. Besides the human cost, the economic cost is devastating. They estimate $78 billion per year for health care, Medicaid, and related costs from this opioid scourge. We have to make sure that the drug industry does not get away with it. They have made billions and billions of dollars from this. The Department of Justice did a settlement with a company called McKesson, which was the largest settlement and fine for a distributor, $150 million. Sounds like a lot of money, doesn't it? $150 million? Until you find out they turned around and gave their CEO a $159 million retirement package. So the drug companies have not been called to task, and they have to be. Now, the state attorneys general are pursuing claims on behalf of the states primarily the Medicaid cost from the state. We run a Medicaid program, and our health costs have gone up because of Medicaid. And the state AGs are bringing those suits. Attorney General Tish James is bringing a suit on behalf of the state of New York. She's doing a very good job. Today, we want to open up another legal front against the drug companies and the entire conspiracy, because it's the drug companies, it's the distributors, it's the retailers. That second legal front will be that these companies defrauded the insurance companies, the health insurance companies, and health insurance companies had billions of dollars in additional costs as a result of the fraud caused by the drug companies. Which means what? Which means health insurance companies were paying these prescriptions. They were then paying for the refill of the prescription. They were then paying for the emergency room when the person overdosed. They were then paying for the treatment facility when the person went into treatment. All those costs, those health insurance costs, get paid ultimately by whom? By you. That's who pays the costs. Department of Financial Services sets the rate for health insurance companies. And the health insurance company will come in and say, well, here are my costs. And a large piece of those costs were due to this opioid scourge. That cost gets built into the health insurance premium that you pay. And the legal case that Department of Financial Services is bringing is these insurance companies, health insurance companies, were defrauded to the tune of billions of dollars. It was an industry-wide conspiracy. Those costs were then factored into the health insurance rate that consumers all across the state paid. So that is going to be a second legal front against these big pharmaceutical companies. And yes, the state AG's case, we're being very aggressive on that. I spoke to the Attorney General about it this morning. We have billions of dollars in damages in Medicaid. The people of the state have also paid billions more in health insurance premiums because these health insurance companies had to pay these inflated costs. And at the end of the day, these big pharmaceutical companies have made billions and billions of dollars. And they have bought off the system. They hire every lobbyist in Washington, D.C., and every lobbyist in every state capital. And they've gotten away with it. Not for 1 year or 2 years or 5 years. They've gotten away with it for decades. Just think about that 2007, the Purdue pharmaceutical officials pleaded guilty. 2007, 12 years ago. They all knew what they were putting out there was highly addictive. And that, frankly, was their business model. Get that first prescription filled, they'll come back for more because it was highly addictive, and they knew it. And it's cost thousands of human lives and billions of dollars. And they're not going to get away with it. They're not going to get away with it. This is the state of New York. You're not going to trample our rights. You're not going to frighten us. You're not going to intimidate us. You're not going to outlawyer us. We're going to make sure that justice is done. And these drug companies are not going to get away with murder. And that's just what they're trying to do, get away with murder, because people died. With that, let me turn it over to Superintendent Lacewell.
Thank you, Governor. As the Governor indicated, the State Department of Financial Services is taking action to hold the opioid industry accountable for this fraudulent scheme in which they misrepresented the efficacy and the addictive nature of these dangerous drugs anticipating, just as Medicaid would cover many of the costs, the health insurance industry would pay a lot of the cost, and those costs are passed on to consumers in the form of rate increases. And over the past 10 years, the dollar figure for what consumers are bearing the cost is $2 billion as an estimate, based on the work we've done internally. As the governor indicated, it's not just about the manufacturers, it's the distributors, the pharmacies, all those who acted in concert, the owners who profited, as well as a role that has not been previously addressed, which are these pharmacy benefit managers, the PBMs, who act as the intermediaries between the health insurance company and the pharmaceutical company and decide where in the drug formulary and these drugs are going to be and how to induce consumers and doctors and so on and so forth to choose particular drugs based in part on cost sharing and what their role was with respect to this elaborate scheme. To be clear, DFS is the regulator of insurance in the state of New York, and that includes, importantly, health insurance. DFS is responsible for the safety and soundness of the insurance industry. It is responsible to look to make sure that fraud does not affect that system. Why? Not just because the system itself is important for the services it provides, but because these are services used, as the governor indicated, by real people who need health insurance for themselves and their families. And the problem here is that this scheme, especially with the trials, including in Oklahoma and the other disclosures that have been made in the public record, the facts and details show that this was a systemic problem, an ongoing systemic problem. It's not just some company that made a pill and they should have done better. This required the concerted action of a lot of players in the industry. And it is fair to say that this opioid scheme has infected our healthcare system and our health insurance system. Consumers at the end of the day are left to carry the burden of the $2 million, and as the governor has indicated, it's not acceptable, and we're going to ensure that we get that recovery back for consumers. The superintendent of DFS has the direct express statutory authority under Insurance Law Section 403C to investigate fraudulent insurance acts as described in the criminal law, the penal law, and to fine wrongdoers up to $5,000 per violation, plus the amount of the claim. So we have many, many tools at our disposal. And the governor is exactly right. This is a systemic issue. We need to generate transparency to the public about what this has done to our health insurance system and the impact on the consumers of this state. So in addition to taking legal action internally, pursuing fines and restitution, DFS intends to hold hearings around the state to shed a spotlight on this problem. And the aspects of that relevant here are insurance fraud, the impact on our markets and on consumers, and also specifically the role of the PBMs, which to date has not been explored. There are many manufacturers and distributors and PBMs that we have already subpoenaed, and we have also directed our insurance industry licensed participants to assist and cooperate, and we've sent them requests for information as well. And you'll find a detailed list at the end of the slideshow. Thank you, Governor.
Thank you. Any questions?
You're not filing a lawsuit of any kind at the moment. You're just launching an investigation, or an ongoing investigation that you're
There is an ongoing investigation by DFS. They're going to have additional hearings around the state, and they will be filing a lawsuit. They have done enough investigatory work to know they will be filing a suit.
Correct.
Is there a timetable? Do you anticipate filing a suit by the end of the year, or you're 8/10 of the way, you just need a few more hearings, or where's this?
What do you want to say?
The facts are fairly known. Suffice it to say, we are acting expeditiously, and stay tuned.
What kind of justice do you expect to see from this impending lawsuit? Like, are you guys going to cut a check to everyone that's filled a Noxy prescription? How is the money going to get back to the consumer?
So the numbers are estimated based on the overprescribing and what % of that was covered by commercial health insurance. understand, of course, that those costs are now baked into the rate increases that were passed on to the consumers. So recoveries that we obtain in that regard will be factored into whether it's rebates or lower rates in the future. We have to address this as a whole stream of rates that consumers are paying across the state.
Remember how the insurance rates get set? Who sets your insurance rate? Department of Financial Services sets your rate. The insurance company comes in and says, these were our costs last year. We spent X in prescriptions and hospital bills and doctor's bills, et cetera. DFS reviews that information. They then set a rate that is fair to the insurance company and the consumer going forward. In these calculations, over these past few years, even increasingly so, were these baked in costs for these unnecessary opioid prescriptions, emergency rooms, treatment, et cetera, which were all part, we believe, of a industry-wide fraud that perpetrated this deception on the people of the country. It also perpetrated fraud on the people of the state of New York, and we think that's to the tune of $2 billion.
And are you concerned about, and there's been a lot of news around Purdue possibly filing for bankruptcy, putting money in offshore accounts to make sure that that money can't be recovered. Are there concerns specifically around Purdue that you're looking at, the rest, like you're saying, that's widespread, that you're looking at retailers, you're looking at distributors?
Well, I think what this suit is going to get at, there's been a lot of focus on the manufacturers, a lot of focus on Purdue and Sackler, et cetera. It wasn't just the manufacturers. This was in my opinion, an industry-wide conspiracy. A manufacturer alone could not do this. There should have been a lot of whistleblowers all along the way. There were a lot of checks and balances all along the way. Manufacturer makes the medication. It then goes to distributors who have actually pleaded guilty to knowing that there was suspicious activity on behalf of the companies that they were fulfilling the prescriptions to, and they didn't say anything, and they kept pushing the drug. It then goes to the retailers, the same thing. They knew there were certain doctors who were prescribing an extraordinary amount of this medication. They didn't say anything. Whenever you have a situation that affects this many people to this magnitude, it tends to be an industry-wide conspiracy. I mentioned earlier the student loans. Student loans were not just the banks. It was the banks, it was the brokers, it was the schools, it was the alumni associations, it was everyone along the chain who was getting their piece of the pie to perpetuate the fraud and the deception, right? And you can just follow it right down the industry chain. You can follow this right down the industry chain. Manufacturer, PBMs, distributors, retailers, all through the chain.
Do you think you're gonna get money back from them?
Absolutely.
Is this a typical kind of category of lawsuit? Like you're sort of kind of suing on behalf of the insurance companies? Not exactly, but I mean, we can understand with Medicaid, which is clearly, a governmental entity that we're alleging fraud and we want to recoup money. But now we're talking about private insurers. Is this a typical kind of action?
This is not money that would go to the health insurers because they already pass their costs along to consumers to the tune of up to $2 billion. This would be action on behalf of those consumers because they should not have to carry the burden of this scheme. The health insurers have already been compensated by the consumers. It's the consumers who are out of pocket and left to carry the bag as usual. Understand, of course, as I'm sure you know, DFS is a regulator. We have to act. How could we not act with respect to this kind of systemic infection of the health insurance system, especially where consumers are at the end of the line? Now, I've said repeatedly Consumers are the center of everything that we do at DFS, and we cannot leave them behind, and we will not leave them behind. They're not going to walk away with the $2 billion loss, thanks to the billions that everybody else pocketed, just because the health insurers were already compensated. And the legislature gave DFS express statutory authority and obligation to investigate insurance fraud. And that's what this is about.
Yeah.
Get X million back from Express Scripts or whatever, how does that get back to I'm insured by Aetna or Emblem or whatever. How does it get back to me? My premium, instead of going up 11% next year, goes up 10%?
There are a variety of ways of doing it, and we would work with the insurance companies to identify what the harm has been to particular categories of the insured based on who the company was and what the plan was, which healthcare plan they had, and what the harm was, and make sure that it is distributed appropriately across the board.
Yeah, but let's remember what happened here. DFS represents the interest of the consumer, whether it's an insurance product, a mortgage product, a banking product, et cetera. They want to make sure the consumer is not defrauded. That's who they represent as the regulator. Here, the consumer was defrauded. Yes, the health insurance company was defrauded, and yes, DFS was defrauded, because DFS set these rates. You have Aetna, your rate went up 7%. DFS allowed that 7% increase. Why? Because the health insurance presented costs, including billions of dollars because of the opioid fraud. And DFS approved those costs. So it went right down the chain. Now, the consumer is the only person who actually writes a check at the end of the day, because you're fueling the entire system. The consumer pays everything ultimately. But you were defrauded, and DFS was defrauded on your behalf when they accepted those rates. And the health insurance company was defrauded by the PBM and the manufacturers when they were asked to pay for those prescriptions, which the conspiracy knew was self-perpetuating. Give them one pill, they'll come back for more. How do you know? Because it's highly addictive, which they knew. Which they knew. And they were right. It was highly addictive. And you killed people. And it cost billions of dollars. And now they think they're going to get away scot-free. No, not here.
And none of the other recoveries would compensate consumers for this loss. So it's got to be done.
Yeah, it's not just the state government that lost money. Yes, we lost money from the Medicaid program. Yes, and we should be made whole. But it's the consumers who paid the lion's share of this fraud. That's where most of the money went. That's where the profit came from. It came from the consumers. So yes, this is a totally separate legal front from what the attorneys general were doing. So they have to deal with the attorney general, they have to deal with the Department of Justice, they have to deal with the U.S. attorneys, and they have to deal with the Department of Financial Services in the state of New York.